Welcome to the Queering Worlds panel for Kidlit Pride at Home. I'd like to thank the people behind Kidlit Pride at Home for putting this together, because I've always wanted to chat about this topic with other authors. And I'd like to thank the panelists beforehand for agreeing to this conversation and to all of my questions. And before we actually get started, I need to say that Natasha isn't able to join us today because of a scheduling conflict. So we're very sad about that. But moving forward, we're going to start off introducing ourselves, and then I'll give a quick intro to the panel and we'll move straight on to questions. I did also solicit some questions from readers earlier today on Twitter, so there will be some reader questions here as well. So I'm Tessa Gratton. I'm the author of several different speculative young adult and adult novels. Most recently, Lady Hotspur, which is a queer and genderqueer retelling of everyone's favorite Shakespeare play, Henry IV, Part 1. And my upcoming Nightshine is a standalone YA fairy tale that is a dark, queer, Howl's Moving Castle inspired story. And now if my panelists would like to introduce yourselves, please. Starting with anyone.
I'll go. Okay. Hi, I'm Aiden. I'm Aiden Thomas. I'm the author of Cemetery Boys. My pronouns are he, they. And Cemetery Boys is a fantasy, a queer fantasy about a trans brujo living in a community of brujettes. And he is on a mission to prove his gender to his community and get the rites of passage that all the brujettes get to have. His plan is to go out and summon the ghost of his cousin who recently died. But when he tries to summon his ghost, he accidentally summons the spirit of the high school bad boy. And it turns into a frolicking, fun fantasy set in East LA.
Why is it so awkward? Okay. My name is Dhonielle Clayton, and I am the author of the Tiny Pretty Things series and the Bells series. And I pitched the Bells as Scott Westerfeld's Uglies meets Marie Antoinette's court, set in a world where everyone is born looking a little strange. But there are these women called the Bells that can change you down to your bones for the right price. So it deals with bodies and beauty and all of the darkness that can come from manipulating your appearance.
I'm Alex London, the author most recently of the Skybound saga. The first book is Black Wings Beating. The second book, Red Skies Falling. And the third book, the finale to the trilogy, comes out on September 1st called Gold Wings Rising. And the Black Wings Beating series, it's about a brother and sister in a world of cutthroat falconry where birds of prey are revered, and the most powerful people in that society are the people who can tame and control them. And it's a story of Bryson and Kylie coerced on a quest to capture and tame the giant, nearly mythic ghost eagle that killed their father. It's a quest story. It's a pretty queer story. And I kind of think of it as Lord of the Rings, but instead of a ring, it's a giant psychic eagle. And instead of little hobbits, it's queer teenagers.
And I'm Natalie Parker. I am the author most recently of the Seafire trilogy, Seafire and the sequel Steel Tide. The third book in that trilogy is called Stormbreak, and it will come out on November 10th. It is my love letter to Mad Max Fury Road. It is a futuristic, starts off as an all-girl pirate gang going up against a tyrannical warlord who has conscripted some of their brothers into wartime servitude. So it is also kind of an epic quest, because once they well, I can't talk about it without giving spoilers of book one, but their goals over the course of the trilogy change, and every book is queerer than the last.
Excellent.
I want to say something about spoilers. I'm actually someone who does not care about spoilers, because I think why I love a book is the how, not the what. So I say spoil away.
Rude.
Alex,
no.
I think probably we should go with majority rules and stick with
Yeah.
spoilers. I too like spoilers. They sometimes make my reading experience better because I know what to look forward to and what I don't have to be worried about. But let's do our best.
We'll honor those who are too weak.
Rude.
Fighting words.
Okay. So this is Queer in the World. We are here to talk about how authors queer our worlds. The family structures, politics, religion, all these cultural markers we use when we're building our speculative worlds from the ground up. Queering speculative fiction shouldn't just be about writing characters with queer identities, but also placing them in cities and landscapes that are also in conversation with queerness. So as we talk about queerness today, I want everyone to remember that we won't only be using it to refer to sexuality and gender identity, but also as a way of engaging with and analyzing our world and new worlds. Queerness as a means of disruption. That's my favorite way to think about it. Disrupting structural understandings of gender, of sexuality and identity, but also disrupting cultural and political structures and the assumptions about our world through new worlds. So, without further ado, our first question, I'd just like all of you to tell all of us where queerness can be found in your work aside from your characters' identities, in your current, recent novels or upcoming novels, whatever you'd most like to talk about. Where is queerness found in the world? I will start just naming people if you don't jump in.
Oh, it was just a lag. So like,
oh, okay.
yeah, for me, I couldn't, everybody froze for a second. So I was like, wait, what's happening? Who's going first?
Did you hear the question?
I did.
Okay.
And I did my homework. I read the questions.
Would you like to go first?
Sure, fine. Okay. I really never get asked this about the Bells universe, but it is something that I did purposefully. I created a landscape and a secondary world that feels very much like an amalgam of some historical periods that we can recognize, like 18th century France and also Japan. And I made it so that it is completely normal for people to have whatever partner they want to have and have whatever marriage they want to have and have any gender or identity that they want to have, because I wanted to create a secondary world where homophobia did not exist, where literally the queen of the world has both a husband and a wife. And so I wanted to have that be a normal part, and that their daughter would experience being raised by both, and that it wouldn't be stigmatized or even a topic of discussion. Because what I've been finding when I'm reading a lot of secondary world fantasies in particular is that the queer body is, and the queer love story or couple is marginalized, even in the fantasy world. And I've always been like, well, why? We're making it up. So why does it have to be negative? And I thought, great, the princess, my villain, she wants to be with whoever she wants to be with. And it's more about power and who's going to submit to her and who she fancies. And I really just didn't want to have a world in which that marginalization was sort of attacked. There are a lot of other reasons why there's a hierarchical structure in my world, and it has nothing to do with gender or orientation at all. And I just was not finding worlds that included that, where it was frustrating for me because I wanted it to be celebrated and just to be part of the fabric of the world.
To echoing Dhonielle, I mean, I did a very similar project in it. I love what you said about power, because for me, the whole book and the writing of that series started with power.
I'm sorry.
Aiden?
I think that we did.
No.
Okay. Aiden's back. Oh no.
Right when I said power, I was like, uh-oh.
I know how much we need Aiden. Okay. Jump back
So
in.
I began with thinking about how does power move in the world I'm inventing? And it moved through birds of prey. That was how power moved. It did not move through gender or sexuality. And so I could create a world where that wasn't a thing. There was a challenge to it because it's a world where that's not a thing. There were no labels for it. But we exist in this world and my readers exist in this world. And I wanted to make sure that my readers knew, whoever they were, that they were included in this secondary world. So how do you write an ace character or a trans character without labeling and without like telegraphing just in like really bad writing? How do you subtly make sure they're there, but also make sure it's very clear they're there? And that was an interesting challenge, thinking about and questioning my own assumptions with pronouns of background characters, things like guard number 3, what pronouns am I going to use? And how do I mix it up and make sure that it is very clear that everyone belongs in this world and everyone has an equal claim on heroism and on villainy. And then also, I think that one of the cool things about that you said about queerness as disruption, I wanted to disrupt the structure, the narrative structure of the story as well. I read an essay by Joanna Russ from I think the 70s, who was writing feminist sci-fi and fantasy, and it's a great essay that everyone should go find, called "What Can a Heroine Do?" subtitled "Or Why Women Can't Write." And it was about the limitations of patriarchal structures in the novel, and she describes that structure of storytelling we all learn, that, exposition, rising action, climax, and resolution. She described it as the same structure as the male orgasm. And I was like, whoa! And so in writing a queer epic fantasy, I wanted to break out of that patriarchal, phallic, male orgasmic structure. And for me, falconry became a way of doing that, where the story itself is built around a spiral. And the characters and the narrative circle this same point over and over, but in tightening, stakes-raising, dramatic ways, hopefully. So structurally, I tried to queer the novel as well.
I love that. I'm going to tag on because I feel like, Aiden, you're going to have a different answer, since I'm also sort of a secondary world fantasy and you're in our world. So I think that I agree with what Dhonielle and Alex have both said. And in Seafire, I was aiming for an acceptance narrative where you have a world in which queerness just exists and isn't marginalized necessarily. Seafire is also a little bit different in that it's more of a destroyed world. It's a far-flung future in a semi-post-apocalyptic state where basically everything was exploded from the inside out. So that includes cities and just infrastructure, but also ways of life and being and people themselves. So the little bits of culture that do come through in Seafire are all they've been a little bit dismantled already. So I used that as a starting place. If everything has been dismantled, that includes preconceived notions of gender. It even includes preconceived notions of violence. And since Seafire is my love letter to Mad Max Fury Road, I had to start in some ways with the violence, because that is one of the things that moved me so much when I saw Mad Max Fury Road in the theater, was the way it was reconceptualizing violence and who is capable of it and how you resist it. And I wanted to continue having that kind of conversation in Seafire. So while Seafire itself starts from a sort of essentialist viewpoint, it kind of looks at the beginning like it's boys versus girls. I appreciate what you're saying, Alex, about using narrative structure to sort of queer the reader experience as well, because that is something that I very intentionally wanted to do through the course of the trilogy. And I think I did.
You definitely did.
I feel very happy with how using the point of view character's lens and assumptions also can queer reader experience. And so that is one of the ways that I approached it. But also, the violence in a world that is destroyed and far-flung like this, coupled with expectations of what we're going to see in a novel that is, or a story that is set inside a violent world. I feel like at least I grew up expecting, especially for a pirate novel, and pirate in like the loosest sense of the word, but especially in novels where you have these enclosed spaces and like roving violent bands, there's always been for me an expectation that that violence will be gendered in nature. And at it, you know, fundamentally that women will be at risk, but anybody who is in our world, like outside of the gender norm, will be at risk when you have these small roving bands that are violent. So I wanted to make sure that my starting point didn't make that necessary, that the world that I was creating, though it was violent, though it was post-apocalyptic, though it was far future, did not necessitate an expectation of gendered violence. And what I found is that you know, flows top down. So it actually required that I had to think about the big bad, the master bad guy in Seafire had to not have an assumption of gendered violence, and it had to flow down from the way that the bullet society is built. And that's, you know, that was really challenging to pull through because it's never from his point of view. So it all had to come through the experience of the people who are really like on the fringes of this society and are coming in to challenge the other kinds of power that exist. So yeah, in that way, I was able to really engage with conversations of violence and action, because Mad Max Fury Road, right? But also without, I was really, really cautious or concerned about not welcoming people into that kind of epic adventure because they were afraid that they were going to be confronted, you know, time and time again with threats of violence. So that was the foundation for queering the world of Seafire. You're muted, Aiden.
Aiden, you're muted.
I'm just having a day, aren't I? So the World of Cemetery Boys is different in that it takes place in our world, the Brujex, so this Latinx community of witches, basically, living in East LA. They're among us. We're in current times. Everything's happening. And I think what's really interesting about this question, specifically relating to Cemetery Boys, is that it's Yadriel's queerness that actually disrupts an entire tradition and belief system. In Latinx culture, a lot of the things that we do, our belief system and kind of our traditions, are things that no one ever questions. We do it, and it is the way that it is because that's how it's always been. And if you try to kind of like poke holes in it and be like, okay, but why? There's not really an answer. It's just like, this is just the way that it is. So they've gone through life thinking in a very binary way about their magic. The men can release spirits to the afterlife. The women can heal the living. And suddenly the child of the head of this community is trans, and they have no idea what to do with it. All they can be like is like, it's a binary. You don't fit into this binary. We don't know what to do with you. It's not that they don't love him. It's that they don't understand him. And because of that, he kind of gets left out. He's not able to have his coming of age ceremony because they're like, well, you don't want to have the Bruja ceremony and you can't have the Brujo ceremony. So it's just, he just kind of gets lost. But what was really important to me was to make it that the magic reinforces your gender identity. Like, even if his community doesn't understand him, even if they're saying that he's one thing and he knows he's another, the magic understands who he is, and the magic reinforces that. And that's kind of what sparks the whole change in this book. And to me, that was really important because for so many queer kids, especially, you know, queer teens, it's like I don't fit into what people are like projecting onto me what I'm supposed to be. But at my core, I know who I am. And so this is like the magic being like, I know who you are too. Like, it's okay. Like, so that was important. And so I didn't like no spoilers, but like, yeah, it ends up, his identity ends up completely disrupting that belief system and how magic works and how these Brujeks think about how their magic works.
I love that, the magic understand. I got really emotional when you said that. Just like so much fantasy, like the heroes spend so much time trying to understand the magic, and it's just this so like I'm like really by the idea that like the magic understands you. I just love that.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was great. I want to jump to a reader question because Alex already brought this up a little bit. When you mentioned terminology, linguistic like world building and thinking about the language is one of my favorite places to start when I'm creating a new world in order to like disrupt and reconceive my own notions. And we're all communicating in English, which is almost unforgivingly binary. And you know, every day we have more and more labels and terminology that we have access to now to describe queerness. But when we are working in speculative worlds of all kinds, we don't necessarily have that same language and the labels available to us. So if any of you would like to talk about that a little bit, like Alex, how did you decide about guard number 3's pronouns? Like, how did you think about that? And like, what pronouns did you use? Did you use the ones that we most have been trying to normalize in English contemporarily, or did you, I mean, we can do whatever we want, so make up pronouns, like that kind of stuff. How do you make those choices when you are actually sitting down to do the writing?
I mean, I think of world building. I mean, I think all writing is world building, right? Even if you're writing a contemporary novel, you're making choices and building a world in the reader's minds, using their assumptions. And kind of every degree of strangeness you add to a story can potentially pull your reader out of the story. So when you're writing a secondary world, you're adding a lot of degrees of strangeness already. So I wanted to stick to sort of the pronouns that our world is most familiar with. And then deploy them in a way that wouldn't pull readers out of the story. So I use he, she, and they. And I kind of tried to use them all enough in enough different circumstances that it almost tuned the reader's brain to know, like, okay, these are the things that exist in this world. But you're kind of, it's the tuning part, especially in the first book in a trilogy where you're teaching the people what the world is and trying to make it feel completely seamless. And I would do that, you know, by characters having conversations with each other where the reader gets to experience their assumptions and their lack of assumptions with each other. And then I just read through, you know, in the revision process to make sure it was as inclusive as possible. And if I had like 16 soldiers that all used he, I was like, no, that's not how I'm picturing it in my head. So I need to make it a more accurate reflection of the world I'm writing. So that was kind of how I did it. And then, you know, there were subtle things I don't want to spoil in the book, but subtle moments where I was like, okay, how can I indicate this person's identity and how they see themselves through how they act or through how other people treat them without them ever having to use a word to make sure it's understood. And that's just whether it's some lines of dialogue or a whole like how a romance does or doesn't develop. But it's so grounded within the world, like I can't really describe it without being like, and here's what happens in chapter 3.
And it's really interesting too, Alex, you brought up this use of language. And I struggled at first thinking about this. In my world of the Bells, there is a lot of emphasis on the news, and there are headlines, and there's magazines, and there's all of these. There's a news corps of newsies who sort of hunt people to sort of catch them when they're not looking beautiful in the way that the paparazzi function in our real world. But I made it sort of like they have these tattlers and all of these different instruments in order to find out, you know what I mean, what changes people have done to their bodies, creating an anxiety, right, for this and to show where the power really lies. And because the world has sort of a more old-fashioned analog, I had to think really carefully about how to code for queerness and how to subtly use words and setups in order to sort of hat trick to the reader. Because I had a lot of, even my copy editors kept changing things and in my headlines. And I remember when my arc came out, a character who is, no one really knows, it's just like a headline, is misgendered in one of my headlines because my copy editor changed it thinking it was a mistake. And then I remember some people were upset and I was like, whoa. I was like, we will change that back. But, there's this assumption that even at every layer of publishing, of all of the eyes that come onto our manuscripts, people literally think what we're doing is wrong and they seek to correct and they will just change it. And so I had it, people literally, the copy editor proofreader thought it was a typo. And I'm like, no. All of this stuff is purposeful. So please check with me before you make an assumption that because I use a different pronoun, that it is not correct. Because there was all of this fuss with my editorial team about, well, they wouldn't use this kind of language. You're doing this old-fashioned 18th century Marie Antoinette feel. They don't have these things. And I'm like, babes, there were queer people always, always. And why? Who cares? Who cares? This is not supposed to be 18th century France. It's not. It's a completely different world that is an amalgam of 3 or 4 different kinds of cultures. And it's brand new. It's my own, stew. It's my own gumbo that I've made. And you're telling me that I can't use the language that I want to use in order to signal to the reader who needs it and who wants it. It's not about you. And so I think that people really fight against the queering of fantasy worlds and resist it because it's always done one kind of way. And when we see either a medieval or we see things that have an analog that is not futuristic or current, there's this resistance. There's this wanting and desire to, there has to be sexism, there has to be homophobia. And I'm like, why can't we take a look at these issues in a different way? And why are you so resistant to allowing me to use different kinds of language for people? So I was really irritated in the editing process when I'm trying to queer this universe. I don't know if any of you have had that experience too, but it was very frustrating to be assumed that these are typos. I'm like, no, those are someone's pronouns. It's not a typo. So
I love my copy editor. My copy editor was awesome and looked for opportunities for me to queer it further. She was great.
You're special, okay, Alex? You're just special.
Than I was. Shout out to the copy editors.
I've gone around and around and around with editors and copy editors about the world, about the word themselves. In particular, just seems to be a real sticking point, repeatedly across projects, which has been very interesting. I write ridiculous worlds with ridiculous, made up words, and that's the one themselves.
Yeah.
Right. I can murder people. I can give someone a pig nose. I can, you know what I mean? You can do all these things, but Lord forbid, I use they to refer to someone. And it's like, oh, this is incorrect. This is grammatically wrong. And I lose it. I really do lose it. And I have to keep my eye on it. And I learned my lesson with that. It's I know I need to watch my proofs and make sure that people don't go in and change my language without letting me know. My books are published from a company that is notorious for, wanting everything to not have queer content. Oh, the big mouse. And so therefore I have to keep my eyes on my work because of the culture in the company itself. Those family values. Who knew that they was an assault on family values? So I have a lot to say, but I'm going to be a good girl.
It's one I love it. So I had some unique obstacles, let's call them, when writing Cemetery Boys, because this is a Latinx community and most of these people speak Spanish. And Spanish is at its core a gendered language. So while Yadril's moving through this world, I wanted to reflect that people who come from a culture that speaks Spanish, there's a lot more misgendering that happens casually, like in conversation, just because words are gendered, right? And so that's a lot more like landmines for Yadril and for Latinx folks to like step on, and then all of a sudden there you are being misgendered. So that was interesting. And then for terminology specifically, I use the word brujex because traditionally it's bruja and it's brujo, and the plural would be brujos, which is a whole other patriarchal issue that we don't need to like break right now. So I went with brujex. I like using the X in order to replace and kind of queer, if you will, Spanish language within Cemetery Boys. And I also thought that like brujex, like hexing someone, sounded really cool. So like that made a lot of sense to me. But yeah, so it's interesting, right? Because I wanted to put forth that idea that having this language can be so hard when you're trans and you're trying to kind of navigate your world, especially for Yadriel, who is like trying to be like, no, like this is who I am, and like the magic is saying like this is who I am too, but you guys still aren't getting it. So yeah, using the term brujex felt like really powerful for me, and I was really, really excited about that.
I think Seafire, again, because it is such a destroyed world, and like there is no, well, there are very few cohesive cultures that exist, and you know, gender is something that we create through language or how we identify gender, and also through culture. And so in Seafire, there weren't very many opportunities language-wise to create new language for queerness. So I think Dhonielle, you were saying like coding is really where it is in Seafire. I'm working on a new project right now that is a full secondary world fantasy. And I have to tell you, after 3 books of like, there is no common culture, there's nothing to like the frustration of not having words and language to use for gender, I'm just like giddy. I'm in this like established secondary world, and all of a sudden I have so many more tools, or it feels like I have so many more tools at my disposal. And using like beyond pronouns, you know, in the world, that there are other ways that you can communicate gender. And this book isn't even sold. It's not even drafted, but I really hope that one day I get to share it with everyone, because I love what I'm doing in that world with gender and language.
Thank you. So Dhonielle mentioned removing queer identity as a marker that creates or reinforces the hierarchy in the world of the Bells. And so I'm curious what other ways you have it put into your own books, or have considered or are working on making a world, whether it's a version of our world or a secondary world, better when it comes to queerness, like for queer people. Have you, like, what are your dreams? What would you like? What kind of world would you like to make for queer people?
For me, I like having queerness that's not automatically labeled a source of suffering is really important for me. And kind of like having gender euphoria take precedence over like what it feels like to, you know, feel bad about it. And I also am a firm believer that like someone being queer isn't the most interesting thing about them. And so like, yes, the character is queer, but like also like this is just me talking about a project I'm working on, but they're also possessed by a demon and they can manifest nightmares. Like that's a lot more interesting. Don't you want to talk about that more? Like, let's talk about their suffering with like the emotional trauma that comes from that. Like, let's not talk about like how sad they are because they're trans and everyone is like mean to them. Like, no, it's like that takes casual queerness can be so revolutionary and so powerful and so reassuring for young readers that that's something that I in my future projects, that's something that I really want to lean into.
I want to just create, and I love that, just that this is one aspect of someone, right? It's not like the only thing about them. Demon possession seems like a little bit more important at the time. I also want to challenge more content creators who create secondary worlds to really think about why they villainize certain marginalizations as a shortcut to create empathy and as a commentary on oppression. Why are certain people always the ones that have to take the lumps to teach the reader about a thing? And so I'm wondering how we can open up worlds in terms of examining all of the different structures and looking at how this kind of thinking, the binary thinking, and also how homophobia is in every single structure. And if you're building a brand new world, why do we need to carry that into it? Why can't we get rid of that and try something else? And I think that we all can sort of create even more interesting worlds if that is not something that your character has to face or even consider or think about. And it's something that I want to continue to do in my fantasies, even when I get people mad at me. I get quite a bit of hate mail about the fact that, you know, in my world, you can marry whoever you want and you can have any gender you want and you can present yourself in any way you want. And that makes people upset. And it makes people upset that a queen who is supposed to be very beautiful would have a beloved who she likes more than her husband. And like that really irritates men who decide to read my book. That is something that is just there in the fabric of the world. And also, I hope that at some point, once we have enough representation, that we give queer characters and worlds that are queers opportunities to go dark, because I do wish and hope that we don't always have to be so precious about our queer babies in brutal worlds have to suffer. Everybody has to suffer, right? In a way of like, you know, I would like to see a good villain or a good, you know what I mean, complicated sort of figure. And I hesitate to do that in representation. And I think about that in terms of race too. I really would like to write a Black villain, but I worry about what that looks like. But I want to be able to be free to do that, to say that they're not a villain because of their queerness. They're a villain because they're a baddie. And you know what I mean? Like they have, you know, it's something completely different. And I want to see if we can hold those two things together at the same time. I don't know about you all, if you want the freedom to do that.
I think that's exactly it. I mean, being able to get far enough away from all of the bad tropes that surround queerness, all the things that you know, that we're all fighting against, but, you know, bury your gays and all the things that we have been exposed to time and time again that do harm. It would be nice to be so far away from them that you could create a beautiful, exquisite, villainous queer character, and not have that ping in anybody's head. That there's an association between queerness and villainy naturally. You know what I mean?
I try and kill a beloved heterosexual side character in everything I write.
Exactly.
I mean, they should go. But also, you know, and I killed a lot of heterosexual people in the world of the Bells, and I also killed one queer person, and that has like haunted me because I'm like, wait, so many people died. She didn't die because of that. She died because she didn't follow instructions. And I'm like, guys, there's so many loving relationships, queer relationships in this book. And this lady didn't follow instructions. Like, so I just think about it a lot, and I do. And maybe I won't. It'll take me a while to write that villain or to have some of our queer babies suffer a little bit more. But I want to have the freedom to do that.
Okay, so what is a world that someone else has written that you would revamp with like a queer skin?
Curveball. On the list.
Oh, this must have been a late reader question that I thought was fun.
Ooh,
I have one.
you got one.
I would redo and queer all of the vampires in and rice. And I would also get rid of
She
her
could have already
racism.
did.
But she didn't do a good job as far as I'm concerned. So I would do it better and also intersect what does that queerness look like in terms of immortality and race and in specific communities, because she was writing within a community that has so much texture in terms of ethnicity and race and culture and doesn't go into any of it. So I would, I think I would redo that.
I would personally love to get my hands on the Harry Potter universe, make a chosen one that's a trans girl, make a Albus Dumbledore that's a trans woman, and then just destroy everything that J.K. Rowling loves, and make it super queer and very trans. That's my personal dream. And I'll work on it, but it's going to take a little bit of effort. But that's my dream personally. Yes.
Mine is similarly vengeance based. I'd love to take the Ender's Game universe and just make it super gays in space.
Oh my God, yes.
Gays in space. I mean, you know what? While we're hitting up the big properties, I'm gonna queer the world of the Hunger Games.
Yes.
Because that world was ripe for queerness.
Mm-mm. Let Katniss be Ace, please.
Well, arguments for already, I think. But
I wish someone would do Lord of the Rings too. Like, I would love to see a medieval world with all of those dirty men.
I wrote in Red Skies Falling, in the sequel to Black Wings Beating, there is the first and only sex scene I've ever written, and it's these two boys, and I talk about how bad they smell because they've been like on their epic quest, and now they're getting intimate with each other, and it's gross. They're teenage boys, and there's nobody bathing, and they're fucking birds, and it's disgusting.
But it's real, and I would love to just, it would be, they're on a quest.
Yeah, I bet Sam and Frodo were pretty stinky.
Yeah.
Come on.
I didn't actually think about it, but I always made sure that there were showers on the Seafire boat. So those girls, they weren't stinky. All the time.
I'm writing a middle grade right now where like half the chapters end with people telling the 13-year-old hero to like go take a shower because he stinks. It's just the reality of middle school.
So to flip this question, what is a book that you admire or love that has a queer world?
I mean, the two of the three on this panel that I've read. I haven't read Cemetery Boys yet, but Seafire and the Bells, I love those queer worlds.
Yeah, I mean, not to just be like heart-eyeing at Dhonielle all the time, but yeah, Bells was like the first time where I really saw it in a way that I like identified with, and that really made it like, I don't know how to explain it. Like, Bells was very dear to me, and it was very precious to me when I read it, and I was just like, oh my gosh, this is so wonderful. This is what I've been looking for. And that's, as a trans Latinx queer person, I don't often see myself in books. But Bells was something that felt very close, and that was wonderful.
You guys knock it off. I mean, I am a stan for all Tessa Gratton books. So, I mean, Strange Grays. And just sort of how we think about love and romantic relationships and connection. And I think pushing ourselves to think through these characters as more than just, like you were talking about, the sum of a part about them, that a lot of different things go into how they love each other. And you do that beautifully in Strange Grace. And it's very complicated in the way that they fall in love. And I just want to see more of that, more of unexpected sort of queerness and digging into, because I feel like in some regard, we're stuck in sort of the queer 101 convo in worlds. And I'm looking for the 201 and where we can find sort of that unexpected and a deeper level of things.
I agree. And I'm sorry, I know I'm about to take this sidestep this question, but I feel like, well, not sidestep it, but I feel like I see a lot in YA, and I read a lot of YA, so this is not like a dig on my genre, but I do feel like there is a lot of that queer 101, especially in fantasy worlds, where you have a story that is beautiful and coming together and fantastical in one way or another, and then all of a sudden there are just some queer characters plopped in to demonstrate, to signal to you that the author is friendly, the story is friendly, queer people are probably not going to be harmed in this story, but they're just dropped in. It's always like over here. And it's these two characters that are going to get together at the end of the novel, or these two characters, or this one character signals that they have a same-sex partner, usually. And I feel like I don't hate this. I'm happy that it's there, but it doesn't ever extend to the world. And when it's just dropped in, I think what I end up seeing is like, this world is built around a binary. This world has at its core binary thinking. This world has at its core a monarchy with questions about inheritance, and that inheritance is tied to bloodlines. And so these are key questions that are not being addressed in the scope of the novel, but you have the queer characters that are dropped in to just sort of make everything feel a little more friendly. And I don't hate it, but I also don't love it because it doesn't queer the world. And so I see that a lot in YA. So the books that I really love are like, and again, I'm sorry, Aiden, I haven't read Cemetery Boys yet, but I'm going to, but like the books that are creating queerness in the world, like Black Wings Beating and The Bells and I mean, Strange Grace and The Queens of Innislear and Lady Hotspur, like these things where those questions are engaged with on the page, and you feel the way queerness is not only just accepted, but it is part of the way of life. And I feel like that is most important to me when I'm looking for books with queer worlds and queered worlds.
I feel like there was some sort of handbook that content creators got where it's like, oh, let's put a little, here's your Black character, check, check. Here's your, oh, there's a character that has two moms, check, check. You know, here is your disabled person in a wheelchair, check, check.
The diversity points.
Exactly, and it has no depth. For example, and I haven't really announced it, but I am working on a third book in the Belle series, and it picks up with a different character, and she is in a queer relationship. And so it will explore all of those things and show how deep it is in the world. It's the world itself, and it's not an issue. It's the issue is that she's in a life or death stakes game. So she has to survive. And that's more of like what it is. And if she can still be with the person she loves. But I just wanted to show that you can have, it has to go from the foundation. It has to be in the earth of your world and built up into the structures, not a little sprinkle here or sprinkle here that you're virtue signaling to the reader that, oh yeah, I'm wokety woke. I have these things in my world. And I think it can be frustrating to see that with Natalie, what you were talking about, where I can go through and check off the list with certain books. I'm like, oh, okay, boop, you got your Black girl. Boop, you've got your, you know what I mean, your queer character. Boop. Oh, check.
I read a lot of YA and a lot of adult because I write both. And in the last several years, there have been two books that I have loved because they're great stories, but also they're doing incredibly interesting queer world building work. And I think anyone who wants a great read and also wants to learn about this kind of thing that we're talking about should read Nine Fox Gambit by Yoon Ha Lee and Ancillary Justice by Anne Leckie. They're both space books, and just incredible world building and foundationally queer. So those are my recommendations for
I
that.
was going to mention Ancillary Justice because that is the last book that I read that actually blew my mind a little bit. And I was like, I feel like I think about gender and queerness all the time, and all of a sudden, and especially if you've ever read The Left Hand of Darkness, if you're familiar with Ursula Le Guin and what she was aiming for with this world in particular when it comes to gender and queerness, Ancillary Justice is the evolution of this conversation, and it just oh man, you brought it up and now my brain is exploding all over again.
Like on a sentence to sentence level, like everything. Yeah, Ancillary Justice.
Yeah. Okay. I have to calm down.
I just read, I love you. I just read Marie Rakowski's The Midnight Live. And look, I'm not going to spoil anything, but talking about queering worlds, talking about a very steamy relationship, like she'll stress you out anyway in a relationship, but this one in particular, I'm like, okay, Marie. I was texting her every 10 pages, like, I hate you. I hate you. I have to finish this in one sitting. And just hearing sort of about like when you return to your universe and you explore these themes, and sometimes publishers aren't so happy about that. And so it's interesting to see how her first trilogy set in this world was received versus now this one with a female love story. How different our industry sort of enjoys that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we can talk for hours about that.
Well, on this note of talking about books that we loved, though, and books that we want to see more of, I think I'm going to call our time. Thank you so much for coming and having this conversation. I could keep having it for 2 more hours at least, and I hope that we get a chance to do that again someday soon. So thank you
so much for having us, Tessa.
Thank you.
Thank you.